It is. Shalom, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday Night Nativ. And again, as usual, I invite you to, if you have a concern, you're more than welcome to send me a note, or if you would like a copy of what I speak, you have two ways to get it. One is actually every time I speak, it's automatically creating a voiceover that you can read. And the second way is I can even send you my notes so that you have those. But anyway, so remind yourself on YouTube, we also have the Nativ channel, and it would be wonderful if you would subscribe so that you can keep up with, well, not just me, but there are several rabbis and Rod Bryant, all of us on there provide you with, well, biblical content from the Old Testament, or what really is called the Tanakh. So at this point in time, I guess I am ready to start. So in our story today, I'm going to spend a lot of time just basically giving you history, geography, some prophecy, a word study. Um, it's always nice to learn their words, especially when you go and read even my art scroll, because that was where I first began to really look at the Bible from a Jewish perspective. And again, as we reach the end of the book, I want us to really pay attention to the overarching theme of this whole book is really about redemption. Now, reading these last chapters, we need to change our mindset regarding time. We're no longer in what's called the Golah. The Golah was the time of the Gentiles. It was the time of the dispersion, the time which they refer to as the Galut. Now we're in the time that's called the Geulah. The Geulah is again the word for redemption in Hebrew. And so we're speaking in terms of the spiritual and a communal understanding of Judaism. Now, as we go through this, we're going to refer to acts that have, well, restoring something that's really a rightful state, encompassing both physical and spiritual liberation. Now, in the ancient world, time was understood as being circular, unlike today, where we spend most of our time thinking of it as being linear. And that really keeps us from really understanding and progressing, because everything then becomes kind of an over and over again. So this time that the time that Jews have always been in is called the law of eternal return. In other words, we begin in Tishri, which is going to be in 2 weeks, and we follow the calendar all the way through and back to Tishri again, stopping at points along the way in order to celebrate or reflect something where we are putting ourselves into a spiritual mindset. Judaism, well, it's a time of clear trajectory. It's the goal of what we're doing. Now, according to Jewish thought, the desired destination of all time and history is a perfected world of peace and prosperity, distinguished by a pervading awareness of God's presence. Now, right now, humanity in general, and the Jewish people in particular, are in a state of exile, even though we're moved on from that. But it was in our way of thinking, we're in exile. We are not where we want to be. We're in a galut. For the Jewish people, the galut is about their collective eviction from the land and their sovereignty. Now, there are moments when it feels like humanity is adrift on some choppy sea of history. So what is the shore that we are all aiming to reach? That's obviously redemption. It's return. It's reconnection and renewal with God. Now, for this, or for the Jewish people, and really for the rest of humanity, it will be one day that we'll reach this uh, era of ultimate redemption. Now, the sages call it Yom Shechalum Shabbat, which technically means a never-ending day of Shabbat. That's found in their Jerusalem Bible. I have a Babylonian Bible, which is a little bit different than a Jewish Bible or a Jewish Talmud, because the Jewish Talmud basically was written in Jerusalem and covers only what happens in Jerusalem. It leaves out all of the other understandings. Now, in Hebrew, the difference between the word golah, exile, and the word gula, redemption, is really a single letter. The letter is an aleph. Now, the aleph in this word is actually silent. What's important is the value of the letter. You see, the letter aleph has a value of 1, and it represents the underlying presence of the aleph, which is also beginning with an aleph. Aleph is God, the one who is in charge, the general. So that's the prevailing thing. Now, the transition from Golah to Gula is marked by the discovery of, well, God's infinite oneness hiding within the fragmented world. Now, according to Kabbalah, God created a world in which presence, well, his presence anyway, is not overt. In fact, we must really work to seek and find him. In the language of the mystics, this is referred to as God's Zimzum, or his self-contraction. Now, his concealment allowed for the emergence of a purely materialistic world in which the so-called natural order is perceived to be completely independent from his divine origins. Now, furthermore, God's Zimzum created the conditions necessary for human free will to emerge, which is the integral part or component of God's plan for this universe or for this creation. I say for this creation because we often think creation goes as far back as, well, creation of Adam. But actually, creations happened long before that. And when we get to the end of this section, well, not tonight or next week, but we're going to talk about cosmic jubilees, talking about time long before and the world the way it was. So according to this task of humanity is to bring home God from his, well, self-imposed exile. Now, the intention is for the original creation, or the creation we are now living in, is to seek God and God to reveal himself and his providence within this world. Now, the whole process will culminate with an awareness that nature itself is supernatural, that there is truly nothing other than God. Now, as the prophet Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, which is the way it should be pronounced, Habakkuk, says in 2:14, "For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge and the glory of God as the waters cover the sea." God's existence is like the silent aleph, as always, he's always present, just waiting to be acknowledged and aligned with, well, thereby transforming what we would call exile into redemption. Now, this dawning of divine consciousness will disclose the seamless fusion of the natural and the supernatural orders, revealing that the perceived dichotomy between nature and divinity was never truly accurate. The divine hand was always guiding natural order. And as we look at Isaiah 30, chapter 30, verse 20, we read, "Your teacher will no longer hide from you." Now, the teacher being God, "For your eyes will behold your teacher." The invisible God will soon reveal himself, but right now he's revealing himself through his handiwork. Now, the earth, our bodies, nature, all have been, well, will all be appreciated for what they truly are, expressions of his divineness. But again, Isaiah says God's unity will be perceived with one's own flesh. Our flesh will be able to discern him, though right now it is very difficult. That comes from Isaiah 40, verse 5. Now, well, though it may not seem like it now, but the fulfillment of Judaism's utopian vision for the future, well, as always, was given by the prophets. And it's always materializing all around us, not through miracles so much, but through natural progress and scientific discoveries. If someone had told you in 1990 that over the next 25 years, the world's hunger would decline by 40%, or that child mortality would be halved, or the extreme poverty would fall by 3/4, you'd have told me that they were naive fools. But the fools were actually right. It is happening. And I believe because of AI, the world is changing even faster, causing even greater, faster changes. It was after the passing of Rabbi Dov Ber of Merzhik, who was the son of Baal Shem Tov, who in 1772 led a group of Hasidim, the righteous pure ones, to settle in the Holy Land. Now, one day, an individual climbed to the top of Mount of Olives outside of Jerusalem, and he sounded his shofar. Now, soon the rumor spread that the Mashiach had arrived, and it was setting off all kinds of commotion in the streets. Now, Rabbi Mendel went out that day to look. Well, actually, he didn't. He went to his window and he sniffed the air. And he was saying, no, unfortunately, the Redeemer has not yet arrived. But on that day, the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea, and all the flesh will perceive the reality of the Creator. Now, he would go on to say, I do not sense the divine truth that will permeate the world in the era of Mashiach. Now, the sages tell us the universal shift in divine consciousness is what will be the result of a global change, and it'll cause great redemption. Not the other way around. Zechariah 12 is a powerful chapter. In fact, it is one of the most messianic and eschatological passages in the entire book. Now, this chapter shifts the tone and establishes the term end of days through this vision that we're going to be seeing today, next week, and the weeks after. Now, it presents Jerusalem as both the center of conflict and the focal point of God's redemption. The structure is simple. In one sense, as in the first 3 verses, we learn Jerusalem is a cup of reeling or a cup of poison, and it's also a heavy or burdensome stone. To whom? For the nations. Nations that try to consume Jerusalem will themselves become intoxicated and stumble, which is happening to Iraq right now, or not Iraq, but Iran right now, which is happening to other places. As a far different story from the Israelite perspective regarding, the past 4,000 years. Now, historically, Jerusalem has been destroyed twice, besieged 23 times, and attacked 52 times, captured and recaptured 44 times. Now, there are 2 parallel verses regarding this concept of poison. Again, Isaiah 51:17, we read, Awaken, awaken, arise, Jerusalem, for you have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, the dregs of the cup of weakness you have drained. David said in Psalms 75:9, for a cup is in the hand of the Lord, and a strong wine, a full mixture, and he pours it out from this cup. but all the wicked of the earth will drain and drink it. Okay, let me begin this story again. The Hebrew word for prophecy, because my Bible begins, if you have an art scroll or whatever Bible you use, my Bible begins by saying the prophecy of the word of Hashem concerning Israel. Now, prophecy is should have been written with the Nabuah. That's the word that should be used. But that is not the word that was used here. Again, the masa, or the burden of the word of Hashem concerning Israel. The burden. Now, even burden is not an accurate enough word. The word masa might be better translated burden, and Rashi says it's a burdensome stone. Israel's actions during the Second Temple period did not merit God's benevolence or his kindness or his redemption. Instead, Judah found itself in exile, and its people were scattered, well, once more, but not to one country, but they were sold across the world to become slaves. Some of them escaped and just simply ran. Others were escaped, but they ended up in the lands of the Ishmaelites, and they've served and labored with them for some 1900 years. Now, the exile and the destruction began with, well, this last exile began with the Romans. Some would have called them the Edomites, because that is a term that's been used often interchangeably between the two. You and I would be called an Edomite. Now, we would read of countless tragedies for the Jewish people in Europe. Well, that was until 1948, with the last being the worst, which is Germany and the Holocaust itself. Now, I want to go deeper as far as this idea of masa, a burden. Again, the word masa literally means burden. It can mean load, and it can mean weight. So this is a weight, it's oppressive. Prophetically, the term becomes a technical term for the prophetic pronouncement, especially one hidden with judgment, with destiny, or with awe. You see, this is finally used by the several other of the other prophets. They also picked up on this word. In Isaiah 13:1, it begins by saying, Masa of Babylon. Nahum in 1:1 says, Masa of Nineveh. So it's the burden that we're talking about. Now, Zechariah 1 or 9:1 began Masa of the word of the Lord in the land of Hadrach. So the prophetic language, Masa, signals that what follows is not casual encouragement, but a very weighty revelation, something carried by the prophet, and he lays it upon the people. So why use Masa here? Well, Zechariah 12 marks a shift. 9 to 14 are often called the oracles or the burdens of Zechariah. Each begins with a Masa. Now, the words hint that the prophecy is a burden both to the prophet and to his hearers. So the prophet must bear the message from God, and the people must bear its consequences. And here it introduces the prophecy as a great upheaval and some sort of ultimate deliverance. Jerusalem would be under siege. Nations would gather in opposition. God chooses to intervene, but not before a mourning period, a promise of a new spirit of grace that would end in this trial. Now, in Kabbalistic or Midrashic thought, Masa can also mean a spiritual weight or a destiny upon Israel. It is not just a burden of doom, it's a cosmic decree tied to Israel's role in the end of days. The Zohar notes that the burden of word implies that God's word itself has, weight. It's pressing down on history until it is fulfilled. Some Hasidic readings say the Masa is also the lifting up. The root for Masa is the word Nasa, which means to carry or to raise, meaning that the prophecy both burdens and elevates Israel. The weight is what will raise them up in the end. Now, notice the verse continues. This is the first verse. It continues by saying, the one who stretched out the heavens founded the earth, and then he founded the human spirit. Now, this makes the prophecy not just political or local, but it's cosmic. Notice it includes the heavens. Now, the burden is the unfolding of God's plan for Jerusalem and the nations at the exact climax of history. Nasa now speaks in terms of being, well, the weight of creation. In Kabbalah, words are never casual. Masa, burden, is not just a prophecy, but a gravity of divine speech pressing into the world. The word masa comes from, again, that root, which means to either lift or to bury. Mystically, this implies that prophecy is both a burden and a lifting up. Israel must carry this destiny, but through it, they will be lifted. Now, in the Zohar, in the third book, on page 221b, it says that the burden of the word is the force of the will descending from the hidden worlds into speech. Speech has weight because it shapes reality, just as God's word at creation birthed the cosmos. It is the same idea when Israel heard from God directly at Mount Sinai. So the burden of the word means when God speaks destiny, it is not abstract. It rests on creation itself, and it bends history towards its fulfillment. Okay, let's look at the rest of the verse. The saying of the Lord, who stretches out the hands and lays the foundation of the earth, forms the spirit within him. So mystically, Masa is going to tie together heaven that's stretched out, the upper worlds, and what we would call the Sephiroth, the upper levels of the 10 spheres that God has established. The earth is founded, that's on the lower world, by Malkut, which is a vessel of manifestation. Now, a human spirit formed, well, that's the middle. That's where heaven and earth meet. Now, the prophecy is heavy because it touches all three planes, cosmic, terrestrial, and the human soul. It isn't just about Israel in history, but it's about the alignment of heaven and earth and the inner soul of humanity. In mystical thought, Israel carries the burden of tikkun. Tikkun is the Hebrew word for cosmic repair. So when Zechariah says the burden of the words concerning Israel, it means Israel is the vessel that must carry and reveal the divine word, well, in history. This burden is both suffering for the nation and nations and being chosen to bear to bring light, divine light. But the weight is paradoxical. Exile and redemption, well, they're bound together. Hasidic masters like the Yehuda Arei Leib Alta, who's also known in veteran circles as Sefat Emet, which is the book that he wrote, or the commentary on the Torah that he wrote, interprets the word masa as an inner weight of the soul, the pressure of divine longing that pushes Israel towards its final destiny. Mystically speaking, masa is not merely a burden, but a weight caused by divine speech that presses on creation until its destiny is revealed. And by linking it to the heavens, the earth, and the human soul or the human spirit, Zechariah shows that the prophecy is not just local. It's cosmic. Now, in Kabbalah, the Shekinah, the divine presence, is often described as carrying the exile. She goes with Israel into exile, bearing their suffering, carried by Israel. Her light depends on Israel's completion of mitzvot and prayers and Torah, which again help to lift her up. Now, so when Zechariah begins the masa of the burden of the Lord concerning Israel, the Zohar and later mystics hear the word burden is the Shekinah carrying Israel's pain and destiny. But at the same time, Israel must carry her. So the burden of sanctity, keeping the covenant alive in exile, is both their responsibilities. Now, Kabbalistically, this burden crosses creation's three planes. And again, notice how the verse reads: the one who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit within him. So mystically, heaven represents the upper, the idea of the earth, Malkut, the lower, and the spirit, the soul. Our soul is the bridge between the two. So Kabbalistically, the tradition teaches that every exile is not just geopolitical, but Shekinah is concealed within. Every redemption is not just military, political, but it's also the lifting up of the Shekinah back to her beloved, back to God. So in Zechariah 12, when the nations gather against Jerusalem, this is the final Masa. It's the greatest, it's the heaviest of the exile. But it's also the moment when the Shekinah is lifted and the spirit of grace and supplication is poured out against, well, you know who, according to verse 12 or verse 10 in chapter 12. Now there's going to be a mourning which is going to be involved, and that's found, we're going to find that next week in 11 through 14. It's the breaking open of heaviness. It's the outcome of this elevation. The Shekinah restored Israel, it lifted it, and creation became aligned because of what's going to happen. Now, mystically, when Zechariah chose to use the word Masa, he was speaking specifically of the Shekinah in exile. Now, the burden carried by Israel and by God himself, the prophecy really begins with Zechariah showing us this burden and how it was woven into the creation itself, all the way back to Genesis 1. Notice I didn't say Genesis 1:1. The Shekinah descended into this world to be lifted up at the end. And again, Israel's destiny is to bear the burden of the word until the end of days, when the Shekinah will be lifted and all the planes, heaven, earth, and the human spirit, they're all going to be reunited. Okay, one more time. 12:1. So the Masa, the burden of the word of Hashem concerning Israel, the word of Hashem who stretches out the heavens and lays the foundation of the earth and who fashions the spirit of man within them. Zechariah is really maintaining that God is in total control of the entire universe. Now, Radak would add to that only God has the power to create or to destroy or to build or to uproot. He mentions that since God created man and it was God who truly put Israel in exile, only God has the power to redeem Israel from the exile. But more than that, the prophet is stressing that the true purpose of the redemption is for the perfection of all mankind. That's us. Now, to that end, in verse 2, we read, "Behold, I am making Jerusalem a saf, a cup of poison, for all the people all around." So Jerusalem is the cosmic center of our world. In Kabbalah, Jerusalem is the heart of the world. And attempts by mankind to move it or to replace it, or, well, it just disrupts the divine order. So from the first days of my search through the scriptures for biblical understanding, I found myself drawn to this history of Israel. Now, over time, I have heard numerous, I can't even tell you how many, messages regarding the end of days, the coming of the Messiah, and the role of Jerusalem in that drama. Now, after the Six-Day War, numerous prophecies, scholars began to tell me a clock was started that would end with this generation or within a generation. Well, it didn't. In fact, right now, there's one that says on September 23rd of this year that there's going to be the rapture of the church. I would like to say that's true, but I can definitely tell you that it's built on false information. The problem was that no one was certain what the word generation meant. Oh, they said the same thing when Israel became a nation in 1948. But here we are, 80 plus years later, and what? Now it's 63 years since the retaking of Jerusalem, and nothing seems to have changed except for President Trump. The Christian timeline is far less accurate than the Jewish one, and I'll give you more information on that next week. It was not until President Trump fulfilled the campaign promise of moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, and that Jerusalem again really became the cosmic center. But what else does that mean? I want to share some history that I shared once before when I was giving you lessons on the book of Daniel. This is a lot of history, and some of you may know a lot of it, or you may not know much of any of it, but I think it's important that you at least understand what Israel has gone through. Now, Jerusalem has become the home to the world's three greatest religions, and it's been that way for centuries. Jerusalem has seen Catholicism and Islam war over this land through, well, the Dark Ages and almost all of human history, while God's chosen, well, they spent most of this time in exile. Now, two world wars have been fought in recent years, with the first leading to what was known as the Balfour Declaration in 1917. It was the right to return for the Jewish people to their ancient homeland. Some people said that this was the start of that generation. If that's true, we are over 115 years later. Now, the local Christian and Muslim communities of then, what was called Palestine, understand there never was a Palestine, and we'll get to that too, who constituted almost 90% of the population, strongly opposed to the declaration in 1970 or 1917. Now, most believe this argument was the meddling of the European powers in the affairs of these non-European territories, with the total disregard for both the presence and the wishes of the native majority, although they were the ones that were really residing there. Now, the result of these world wars has been, well, a constant stream of conflicts all across the Middle East ever since. Now, at times, the British, well, their commitment to establishing a Zionist state where it is not wanted, or it was not wanted actually, became the focus again and again of the British Parliament. In the Arab world, the declaration was seen as a betrayal of a wartime understanding between Britain and the Arabs, between Britain and Jordan, Britain and the Arabs of Saudi Arabia. Now, it was in 1919, after the war, that there was a signing of an armistice when the affected territories were asked to sign and to ratify a treaty called the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Middle East back then was called the Far East. It's changing. In fact, it was It was given the new name as the powers no longer saw the Far East as being that far away. New nations were actually being extracted by the British, by the Dutch, and by the French. They were renaming areas, crossing tribal boundaries, all because of oil and the resources that were going to be given to the European colonies. Now, this is on track for a special status, but again, there was supposed to be an area for the Jews, but it wasn't going to be much. Now, as a result, Britain faced an Arab revolt. Now, early in 1920, we witnessed the first of many Arab-Israeli conflicts. It would often be referred to as the world's most intractable conflict. The British soon realized that it was impossible for them to pacify these two groups. It was then that the Palestinian Royal Commission was established. Its first recommendation was to call for the partitioning of the region. Good luck. On April 25th of 2020, there was a San Remo conference. It was held in Italy at a very nice resort. It was the outgrowth of this Paris Peace Conference that had been held by the British and the French and the Italians. Even the Japanese were involved. Now, it established the basic terms for the three League of Nations mandates, because you see, by now the League of Nations had been established, the first of the United Nations efforts. Now, the word Palestine was the result of Britain's attempt to end the dispute. You see, there never was a Palestine before 1920. Never. Now, it stated that the British were responsible for putting it into effect, the terms of the Balfour Declaration, and the French and the Italians made clear they disliked the idea of a Zionist state as part of the Palestinian Mandate. And they objected especially to language that, well, it did not safeguard the political rights of the non-Jews. Now, the boundaries of Palestine were left unspecified. They were to be determined by the principal Allied powers. Well, 3 months later, the French defeated King Faisal's Arab kingdom in Syria and elected to have that land also redistributed as part of this new agreement. Well, the whole territory was soon to be known as Transjordan, which tied in with the area now referred to as Palestine. It wasn't until 1922, that Congress officially endorsed and America supported the idea of this Balfour Declaration. Well, it came through the passage of the Lodge Fish Resolution, Henry Cabot Lodge Fish Resolution, and it was not without its critics who believed that the President Wilson and Congress ignored democratic values in favor of, well, biblical romanticism. Now, when they endorsed that declaration, it was noted that the large, well-financed and well-organized pro-Zionist lobby in the United States was quite active in establishing this resolution, while at the same time the country's, well, the United States at that time was had a very small Arab American community, and they had no political power and they were forced to acquiesce. Now, in 1936 to 39, there was an Arab revolt in Palestine, but it was also superseded by tensions coming from Adolf Hitler and his Third Reich. The British Parliament approved what would be known as the White Papers in 1939, and this was the last formal statement of governing policy for the mandatory Palestinian state, declaring that Palestine should not become a Jewish state and placing restrictions on Jewish immigration. Now, this would result in many Jews attempting to flee Nazi persecution actually, they were trapped in Europe, having no place to go. Now, while the British considered this consistent with the Balfour Declaration, the commitment to protect the rights of non-Jews, many Zionists saw it as a repudiation of the Declaration itself. Now, this policy, well, it only lasted a few years because in 1948, the British surrendered the mandate. A civil war ensued, and the Jewish people earned a sliver of land in what is now known as the kingdom. Now, with that as your backdrop for our verses, is it any wonder that Jerusalem, which is, well, the fundamental part of the three religions, would become a place of controversy and violence? It will become a more significant and controversial place as the times draw nearer to the Messiah coming. Radak, Abarbanel, Metsudos, well, they all saw Jerusalem, well, leading to their problem would lead to a siege of the city in the end, and mankind's understanding that the city was poisonous for all who chose to attack it. Well, that became obvious. Now, Radak tells us that the people mentioned here are the armies of Gog and Magog. He notes that they will lay siege to the city, believing that the taking of Jerusalem and the resistance of God's people will be destroyed, and the lack of confidence will cause the nations to fall quickly into their hands. Malbim believed that the army of Gog and Magog will be composed of the Edomite nations, was the Europeans and those that were part of Esau's kingdom. And at the time of the city of Jerusalem will be controlled by the Ishmaelites of all. That's the Arabs. Now, this would have been a repeat of the Dark Ages, and what we would today call the Crusades would have begun to happen. Now, Malbim lived in the 1800s, and I'm sure he couldn't have imagined all that has taken place since he died. We understand that God will, well, he'll wage war with both groups and repaying them for what they put the Jewish people through for these last few years. Again, remember the Hebrew word saf, which roughly can be translated as cup or basin, and can also speak to the threshold of poison. Now, Rabbi Mahari Kara, Jerusalem will be like a high threshold that nations will want to jump over or across. But it will all, well, they're all going to stumble and they're all going to fall. And it's fascinating that some men of the tribe of Judah will, according to chapter 12, verse 2, second half of verse 2, are going to participate on the side of the enemy. I don't know how many of you watched the fiasco going on in New York City with the colleges and the tent cities that were put up by the Palestine or by the Arab people. Understand that on their side were a number of Jews, heretic Jews, who happened to also believe that, well, the Messiah hasn't come, so the land should not be ours. Now, this past October, one could have witnessed this when the Jewish flags were actually waving on campuses. Now, Malbim believed that when Gog and Magog arrive at Jerusalem, they'll be using a battle plan that was actually Sennacherib's, one that he had developed when he was an Assyrian king way back in 2 Kings 18. Now, before attempting to defeat Hezekiah, he conquered all the major cities surrounding the Jewish capital. And he holds that many Jews, well, they'll join his effort. They'll become his fifth column. And these Jews will be such, well, they'll be given a name. Well, and another idea is that over the centuries, many Jews have been forced to accept Christianity. Remember the story of 1492 and Spain. Many will feel their Jewish roots and will turn within themselves back to God and back to Israel. There'll be a fifth column for Israel. they'll be part of the first wave to accept salvation. Now, we all remember how on May 14th of this year, that the U.S. Embassy was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, fulfilling the contraction or the congressional resolution that had gone unacted upon since 1992. And the President Trump's personal pledge that he made in 2016, well, that was a campaign pledge that he fulfilled on December 6th, December 6th. Now, these actions have reshaped the focus of the peace talks. They have gone nowhere since the days of President Clinton, Yasser Arafat, and Yitzhak Rabin when they signed that Oslo Accord in 93. There have been other players who have had a hand in messing up what's going on. And I go back to September 2001. Ariel Sharon, after being elected prime minister, stated for the first time that Palestinians should have a right to establish their own land west of the Jordan River. Now, this is where we get the slogan from the river to the sea. Now, in May 2003, Sharon endorsed a roadmap for peace, is what it was called, that they had been put forth by the United States and the European Union and Russia, which opened a dialogue with Mahmoud Abbas and announced his commitment to the creation of a Palestinian state in the future. Now, he embarked on the course of unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip while maintaining control of its coastline and airspace. Well, Sharon's plan was, well, it was welcomed by both the Palestinian Authority and the left wing of Israel. It was a step towards the final peace settlement, according to them. However, it was greeted with opposition from within his own Likud party and from other right-wing Israelis who, well, they saw the loss of their loss as a failure of national security. Now, we need to understand that some of the greatest opponents of Israel's occupation of the homeland are, in fact, Jews, whether it's the government of Israel or the service of the foreign governments. So, do you remember Gush Katif? It was part of that Sharon farce. It was part of a series of 17 Israeli settlements that had occupied a space of land between what is now Israel and Gaza. And in 2005, Gush Katif, well, it represented 10% of all the agricultural produce raised in Israel. It accounted for 65% of Israel's organic export, 90% of Israel's bug-free leafy vegetables, 45% of their exports, 95% of Israel's cherry tomato exports, 60% of Israel's herb exports, and 60% of Israel's geranium and flower exports. All this came solely from Gush Katif. Now, there were 350 families who agriculturally had created this enterprise at Gush Katif, which is really not just a city, but it's the series of cities. Now, there were 4,000 or 5,000 Jews and 5,000 Palestinians who worked there. Gush Katif was just a hothouse where in less than 2 weeks it was in ruin. The buildings were, well, they covered over 1,000 acres, and they were worth probably $80 million back in those days. Now, the annual revenue lost by Israel was $60 to $70 million. So many of the residents of Gush Katif were never paid for their losses. Now, were they ever assisted in relocating? A man named Dov Weissglass, Ariel Sharon's personal consultant and confidant, later shared that the destruction of Gush Katif was requested by the Palestinian Authority and its head, Mahmoud Abbas. Weissglass revealed that that the information in response to Reserve General Yom Tov Samai, who was the Army radio, who was on Army radio, that Sharon was abandoning what was known as then as the Philadelphia route, which ran from Gush Katif. It was a battlefield that was along the Mediterranean area. Anyway, the battle route often used by David in those days to reach Palestine. But the problem was Ariel Sharon gave away what he should never have given away. Excuse me. I don't know how many of you remember him, but he was a man, a great military mind. But he suffered from obesity, chronic heart problems, and high cholesterol. It was easy to understand if a man who loved food, who only stood 5'7" tall, and yet at the same time weighed well over 255 pounds. Stories of Sharon's appetite and obesity were legendary in Israel. And he would often joke about his love of food and his expansive girth. His staff car was reportedly stocked with snacks, vodka, and caviar. Now, his doctors, his friends, and people on the staff tried to impose a diet on him, but it was never very successful. And shortly after signing away Gush Katif, Sharon was hospitalized, forcing a minor stroke sent him there. But during his hospital stay, doctors discovered he had a heart defect requiring surgery and ordered bed rest pending the cardiac catheterization. A week later, Sharon immediately, he just returned to work, and he had a massive heart attack from which he laid in a coma for well over a year. Then he passed. Now, Zechariah now describes the punishment that comes to those attacking Jerusalem in these last days. And he begins by calling the city of burden, or burdensome stone. Look at verse 3. And it shall come to pass on that day that I will make Jerusalem a stone of burden for all peoples. All who bear it shall be gashed, and all the nations of the earth shall be gathered about it. Now, those choosing to become involved in the affairs of Jerusalem will soon be finding themselves scarred by their actions. Now, recently, several European nations have called for the world to create a two-state solution in Jerusalem again, with Israel coming close to ending the Gaza war, which I believe began on October 7th, 2026, the final day of Sukkot, but it was actually, that was what we would actually say, well, the Christians would call it the end of the time of the Gentiles. Daniel would call it the end of 70 weeks. The footsteps of the Messiah are coming louder or becoming louder each day. Now, just like anyone who tackles a burdensome stone strains under its size and weight and soon calls for help from others, so too will Israel's attackers call for assistance. The defenders of Jerusalem will be nearly impossible to dislodge them without massive assistance, which is the subject of next week's story. I've gone 55 minutes, so I hope I gave you enough information to query and understand what we're about to cover when we go into verse number 4. So for now, I want to say shalom, and I want to say Laila Tov. Okay, folks. Any questions?
Well, I really liked the fact that we were the bridge. When I read that, I went, oh, the fact that God created us to connect heaven and earth. Wow. What a cool concept.
It is. It is. And I
But
wasn't
I
the first
did
one to
get,
think of it.
it bugged me that masa kept coming up because I lived in Mexico. I have Mexican neighbors. They use a lot of masa. And that's where my brain kept going every time I read that word.
Oh, yeah, Hebrew and Hispanic are it's two different languages. So, but
I
anyway,
know. I know.
well, I hope I gave everybody enough information and I didn't put you all to sleep. Glenn is working hard to hold his eyes open, but the rest of you, I can't see your faces, so I don't know whether you're awake or asleep. But oh, there's Glenn. So I know he's awake. So
Worked
again,
hard today. That's why I was busy.
that's okay. I only meant to make fun of you. So,
I know. It's okay.
okay.
Makes me important.
Yes, I still can remember your name. And I haven't lived in Indiana for a couple years now.
Hmm.
So, but anyway, anybody have any questions or thoughts? Well, you're a nice, quiet group.
There was a lot in there.
I'm glad you said that because I was wondering, it took me 10 pages to write what I gave you, and I got 10 more pages for next week.
Uh-huh. Well,
So,
yeah, I get it.
okay. Well, I appreciate you getting it. So
I enjoyed it, so thank you so much.
you're very welcome. Y'all have a good night. I will see some of
Thank
you
you.
tomorrow morning for Rod's class, and for the rest of you, I'll see you next week. So
Okay.
shalom, Lila Tov.